April 18, 1942, airweight to 20 a.m., USS Hornet, 650 miles east of Japan. The launch reports would never fully capture what Japanese naval intelligence witnessed that morning through picket boat radio transmissions. American aircraft carrier detected precisely where defensive calculations predicted. But launching twin-engine bombers that defied every principle of naval aviation, the Imperial Navy understood about carrier operations. Through the morning Pacific haze, 16 North American B-25 Mitchell medium bombers sat crowded on USS Hornet's flight deck, each weighing 35,000 pounds with 67-foot wingspans that made carrier operations physically impossible according to universal aviation doctrine. Japanese carrier-based aircraft weighed 8,000 pounds maximum, launched from 800-foot decks with arresting hooks for landing recovery. The B-25s possessed no carrier modifications, required 275-foot minimum takeoff distance on land runways, and could never land back aboard the carrier deck. Japanese defensive planning had accounted for every scenario protecting the homeland. 600 miles of picket boats created early warning perimeter. American carrier-based dive bombers possessed 200-mile combat radius, forcing carriers to approach within Japanese fighter interception range. Mathematical certainty protected Tokyo. American carriers couldn't reach launch distance without detection, and carrier aircraft couldn't fly the 650 miles from safe positions to strike Japanese cities. The Americans were operating under mission parameters the Japanese had calculated as technically impossible. While Imperial Navy intelligence assumed detection meant standard carrier task force with short-range aircraft, they faced Army Air Force's medium bombers modified for one-way missions that violated every assumption about carrier aviation capabilities. 80 volunteers had written goodbye letters expecting 50% casualties. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle stood in the lead B-25 cockpit preparing for a launch that would prove America's willingness to attempt the impossible. The most shocking challenge to Japanese defensive superiority was revealing itself. Not in superior technology or numerical advantage, but in American innovation and sacrifice creating options the Imperial Navy had never imagined possible. These bombers were about to prove that when Japanese strategists calculated impossible, Americans found a way anyway. For 4 months after Pearl Harbor, Imperial Navy staff officers assured Tokyo that the home islands lay beyond the reach of American air power. Their certainty rested on mathematics, geography, and a layered early warning system that, on paper, rendered any carrier raid suicidal long before enemy aircraft could threaten the capital. First came distance. Tokyo sits more than 2,000 miles from the nearest American land base, while the longest-ranged U.S. carrier aircraft of 1942, the SPD Dauntless dive bomber, could strike barely 200 miles from its deck and still recover. Japanese planners therefore concluded that a U.S. carrier would have to steam inside a 300-mile arc just to launch a zone patrolled by submarines, picket destroyers, and 70-ton trawlers strung in parallel lines roughly 600 miles offshore. Each vessel carried radios set to broadcast contact reports the instant a task force appeared, providing at least 6 hours warning for interception. Second came fighter cover. 4 frontline fighter groups, roughly 240 Mitsubishi A6M0 interceptors, remained on permanent alert around Tokyo, Yokohama, and Nagoya. Scrambling from airfields at Yokosuka and Atsugi, these Zeros could climb to 20,000 feet in 6 minutes and outrun any Allied aircraft known to Japanese intelligence. Anti-aircraft artillery, upgraded after war games in 1941, ringed the Imperial Palace and major shipyards with 75mm Leporus and 120mm guns directed by optical rangefinders. More than 300 heavy pieces inside the metropolitan prefecture alone. No enemy pilot had ever tested those batteries, but training films boasted that no bomber shall cross the Sumida River alive, a slogan painted on searchlight emplacements along the eastern suburbs. Third came hardware limitations U.S. engineers were presumed unable to overcome. The North American B-25 Mitchell, the smallest American medium bomber, still weighed 35,000 pounds at takeoff, required at least 275 feet of runway in perfect conditions, and lacked any arresting hook for shipboard recovery. Even if a U.S. admiral risked placing a fleet carrier inside the picket line, Japanese analysts calculated that the Mitchell would either plunge into the sea before reaching rotation speed, or if it somehow staggered into the air, run out of fuel hundreds of miles short of safe landfall. Carrier-borne torpedo or dive bombers could reach Japan, but they carried only 500-pound loads, insufficient in Tokyo's view to inflict strategic damage. These numbers bred complacency. Civil defense drills were minimal. Blackout curtains were still optional, and school children collected scrap metal for imperial victory rather than for air raid shelters. Newspapers praised the perimeter picket flotilla, describing the ring of rust-colored trawlers as an iron curtain against the barbarians of the Pacific. Even Admiral Yamamoto, who knew American ingenuity firsthand, told subordinates that a direct strike on Tokyo could not occur for at least 6 months without first capturing forward island bases. Yet the very logic that lulled Tokyo into false security masked a fatal blind spot. Japanese calculations assumed their opponent would play by the same engineering rules and risk equations that governed Imperial Navy doctrine. They did not foresee a scenario in which American commanders would load 16 land-based bombers onto a single carrier, strip every ounce of armor, triple the fuel load, and then launch 7 hours early from 650 miles out, knowing the aircraft could never return. An operational plan built on courage, improvisation, and acceptance of near-certain loss lay outside the predictive models of a staff culture that equated honor with flawless execution rather than daring experiment. Thus, when picket boat Nitomaru flashed its routine contact report at 03 hours on 18th April, Tokyo's air staff assumed a standard carrier group whose fighters posed no homeland threat. They had no contingency for B-25s roaring off a heaving deck at dawn, proof that American audacity could overturn equations thought unbreakable. That miscalculation, born of impeccable logic yet ruined by imagination's limits, ensured the first bombs would fall on Tokyo by noon. President Franklin Roosevelt demanded retaliation within 72 hours of Pearl Harbor, setting in motion the most audacious technical gamble of the Pacific War. In January 1942, Captain Francis Lowe of the Navy's Submarine Warfare Division proposed a concept that violated every carrier doctrine manual: launch Army medium bombers from a carrier deck positioned just beyond Japan's picket boat screen, then fly the bombers onward to China rather than attempting the impossible carrier recovery. The plan required solving problems no aviation engineer had ever confronted in combat conditions. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a former racing pilot with a doctorate in aeronautics from MIT, received orders to make the impossible operational. His selection criteria were brutally simple: the smallest twin-engine bomber capable of carrying a 2,000-pound bomb load, modifiable to launch from 275 feet of deck space, and expendable enough that losing every aircraft would still justify the mission's strategic value. The North American B-25B Mitchell met those specifications, barely. At Northwest Orient Airlines Modification Center in St. Paul, Minnesota, 24 B-25Bs underwent surgical weight reduction that would have horrified peacetime safety inspectors. Mechanics stripped all armor plating from cockpits and fuselage, saving 650 pounds. The classified Norden bomb sight, worth more than the aircraft itself, was removed and replaced with a 20-cent aluminum post and notch sight, fabricated in base workshops. The remotely operated lower gun turret became a 160-gallon fuel bladder, while additional rubber tanks filled every available fuselage cavity, increasing total capacity from 694 to 140 gallons. Painted broomstick handles protruding from tail cones simulated defensive guns to deter rear attacks. The modifications bought range but guaranteed one brutal truth: these aircraft could launch from USS Hornet but would never land back aboard. Volunteer selection began with brutal honesty. At Columbia Army Air Base in South Carolina, Doolittle assembled 25 crews and explained the mission parameters without euphemism. This is a one-way trip. We'll bomb Japan, then fly to China hoping to reach friendly airfields before fuel runs out. Expected casualties are 50%. If you want out, step back now, no questions, no consequences. Not one man stepped back. The final 16 crews were chosen by deck capacity limitations, not lack of volunteers. 80 men, average age 24, wrote final letters to families and reported to Eglin Field, Florida for training that assumed half would never return. At Eglin's Auxiliary Field 3, crews practiced short-field takeoffs from a runway marked with white lines simulating USS Hornet's 467-foot launch corridor. They flew wave-top navigation runs across the Gulf of Mexico at 50 feet, stayed airborne through simulated 12-hour endurance missions, and rehearsed night landings they would execute in China after bombing. Lieutenant Henry Miller's crew crashed during training on March 23rd. All survived, but the wreckage reinforced that this mission balanced on margins where single errors meant death. On April 2, 1942, 16 B-25s were craned aboard USS Hornet at Alameda, California, filling the flight deck so completely that the carrier's own fighters had to be removed. Task Force 16 departed San Francisco Bay under radio silence while crews finally learned their target: Tokyo. As USS Hornet steamed west across 5,000 miles of Pacific, those 80 volunteers understood the mathematics perfectly. They had fuel for a one-way journey, faced the most heavily defended airspace in Asia, and depended on Chinese airfields they might never reach. But 4 months after Pearl Harbor, America needed proof that Japanese shores were not untouchable, and 80 men considered that mission worth their lives. At 03 marks on April 18th, the Japanese picket boat Nitomaru detected Task Force 16 at 650 miles, 150 miles beyond the planned launch point. Admiral William Halsey faced immediate choice: abort the mission or launch 7 hours early from a distance that left marginal fuel for reaching China. At 07:38, USS Nashville's guns sank the picket boat, but its radio warning had already transmitted. Halsey's signal lamp flashed across the morning swells. Launch planes to call Doolittle and gallant command, "Good luck and God bless you." USS Hornet turned into 30-knot headwinds, her deck pitching through 12-foot swells as Doolittle's B-25 positioned for the 08-20 launch. The bomber sat 467 feet from the bow, less than optimal but sufficient if the pilot held full throttle and released brakes at precisely the right instant. Doolittle's co-pilot Richard Cole locked the brakes while right engine screamed to maximum power, then released on the deck officer's flag drop. The B-25 accelerated down wet wooden planks, nose wheel lifting at the deck edge before the bomber dropped toward the Pacific, then clawed into climbing flight. Within 60 minutes, all 16 aircraft launched successfully, the heaviest bombers ever catapulted into combat from a carrier deck. The 5-hour flight to Japan proceeded at wave-top altitude, each crew navigating by dead reckoning across 650 miles of ocean with fuel gauges dropping toward critical minimums. Japanese coastal radar detected formations approaching at noon but assumed high-altitude bombers, scrambling interceptors to 15,000 feet while the B-25s roared inland at 200 feet. Tokyo air defense batteries opened fire when Doolittle's bomber crossed the city limits at 1,500 feet, but the Mitchell's 230 mm of speed and evasive jinking defeated optical rangefinders designed for slow high-altitude targets. Doolittle's bombardier released 4 500-pound bombs over industrial facilities in northern Tokyo at 12:15. The remaining 15 crews struck Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe across 30 minutes, delivering 64 bombs that ignited oil storage tanks, demolished munitions factories, and killed approximately 50 Japanese while wounding 400. Japanese fighters attempted interception, but the B-25s flew too low and too fast, disappearing westward toward China before coordinated pursuit could organize. The flight to free China became a desperate fuel race against darkness and weather. Deteriorating visibility over the Chinese coast eliminated any possibility of locating planned airfields, and communication failures meant runway lights remained dark even as crews searched through storm clouds. At 21:20, exactly 13 hours after launch, fuel exhaustion forced 15 crews to bail out over unknown terrain in total darkness. Lieutenant Ted Lawson's crew crash-landed in the East China Sea. Lawson survived but lost a leg to gangrene. Corporal Leland Factor drowned when his parachute dragged him underwater. Sergeant William Dieter fell to his death from a cliff in the blackness. 8 raiders descended into Japanese-occupied territory and were immediately captured. 64 airmen survived through Chinese civilian heroism that defied comprehension. Village families hid American raiders in root cellars despite knowing Japanese retaliation would be savage. Guerrilla networks guided injured crews through 200 miles of enemy territory to nationalist lines. Not one Chinese collaborator betrayed the Americans to Japanese patrols, though the penalty for harboring enemy airmen was immediate execution of entire families. By June 1942, most survivors had reached safety. 16 aircraft lost, 3 dead, 8 captured, but the mission complete. Tokyo had burned, and Japan's invulnerability myth lay shattered in the wreckage. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor and Japan's most brilliant naval strategist, became physically ill upon hearing that American bombers had struck Tokyo. The man who had personally guaranteed the emperor that the homeland would remain inviolate for at least 6 months regarded the raid as a personal defeat that incapacitated him for days. His professional humiliation reflected broader psychological devastation spreading through imperial headquarters as staff officers confronted the impossible. Americans had achieved what Japanese calculations proved could never happen. Tokyo civilians witnessed the catastrophe firsthand as B-25s roared over the imperial palace at rooftop altitude, shattering government propaganda that had promised absolute homeland security. Radio broadcasts initially denied any attack occurred, then admitted minor damage from criminal air raid. But citizens who had seen American bombers with their own eyes recognized official lies. The psychological wound cut deeper than physical destruction. The air raid shaken the Japanese because many common people firmly convinced that after all, Japan could not be successfully attacked, contemporary accounts recorded. Where before they had imagined themselves safe from aerial aggression, Japanese now searched the skies each morning and each night. Military response revealed panic masquerading as prudence. Within 72 hours, Imperial General Headquarters ordered 4 frontline fighter groups, over 200 aircraft desperately needed against American forces in the South Pacific, pulled back to defend the home islands against future raids. These squadrons would sit idle around Tokyo for months while American forces established air superiority over Guadalcanal and New Guinea. The defensive reallocation transformed Japanese strategic posture from offensive confidence to homeland protection, exactly the psychological shift Roosevelt had demanded. The raid confirmed a decision made 8 days earlier to extend Japan's defensive perimeter toward Midway Island, seeking to draw American carriers into decisive battle. Yamamoto's obsession with destroying the US Pacific Fleet intensified after Doolittle proved Japan's vulnerability. On June 4, 1942, that obsession produced catastrophe at Midway, where 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, sank beneath American dive bombers in a single day. Japan never recovered naval superiority. The direct connection was undeniable. Doolittle raid's psychological shock drove strategic overreach that enabled America's first decisive Pacific victory. Japanese fury manifested through savage retaliation against Chinese civilians who had sheltered American raiders. The Zhejiang Jiangxi campaign, launched in May 1942, systematically exterminated entire villages suspected of assisting the escaped airmen. Field Marshal Shunroku Hata's forces killed 250,000 Chinese civilians and 70,000 soldiers across 4 months of deliberate massacre. The genocidal scale revealed how deeply Doolittle's raid had wounded Japanese pride. 80 Americans on a one-way mission had inflicted psychological damage so severe that Japan murdered 250,000 innocents seeking revenge. Intelligence assessments transmitted to Tokyo acknowledged fundamental miscalculation. American innovation, fuel modifications, weight reduction, carrier launch techniques had achieved breakthroughs Japanese engineers considered physically impossible. The terrifying question haunted imperial planning. If Americans could accomplish this, what other capabilities had Japanese strategists underestimated? The answer would emerge through 3 years of American industrial and tactical superiority that ground Japan towards surrender. Daily life transformed across the home islands as air raid drills, blackout protocols, and civil defense measures became mandatory. The confident nation that had celebrated Pearl Harbor now lived in fear of skies that could deliver destruction without warning. 80 American volunteers had accomplished what battleships and diplomatic pressure could never achieve. They had broken Japan's psychological invincibility and set in motion strategic consequences that culminated in total defeat. Americans awoke on April 19, 1942 to front-page headlines screaming "US bombs Tokyo," and experienced a morale explosion that erased 4 months of Pearl Harbor humiliation. Newspaper extras sold out within hours. Movie theater newsreels showed B-25s launching from USS Hornet's deck to standing ovations. The raid derailed questions over government's failure to guard against Japanese aggression and transformed national psychology from defensive despair to offensive confidence. When reporters pressed President Roosevelt on where the bombers originated, he smiled and answered Shangri-La, the fictional Himalayan paradise, maintaining operational security while delivering a message Japan understood perfectly. America could strike anywhere, anytime, and Tokyo would never know how. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle, convinced he would face court-martial for losing all 16 aircraft, instead received promotion 2 ranks to Brigadier General and the Medal of Honor from Roosevelt personally. All 80 raiders received the Distinguished Flying Cross. The 64 who eventually returned became national heroes, touring war bond rallies where crowds packed auditoriums to hear first-hand accounts of bombing the invincible Japanese homeland. The raiders themselves remained characteristically modest. "We just did what needed doing," became their standard response to adulation. Strategic vindication arrived 6 weeks later at Midway, where American codebreakers and dive bomber pilots destroyed 4 Japanese fleet carriers in the decisive naval battle Doolittle's raid had provoked. Japanese overreach, extending their defensive perimeter in panicked response to homeland vulnerability, created the opportunity American forces exploited perfectly. The turning point of the Pacific War traced direct lineage to 80 volunteers who had proven Tokyo could burn. The B-29 Superfortress strategic bombing campaign of 1944 to 1945, which devastated Japanese cities and forced surrender without invasion, rested on psychological foundations Doolittle established. Every incendiary raid that filled Tokyo's skies with fire exploited the terror Doolittle had planted in April 1942, when he proved Japanese homes could be reached and burned. The operational template, accept aircraft losses to achieve strategic psychological effects, became American air power doctrine that continues today. Modern supercarriers launching aircraft weighing 50,000 pounds trace technical lineage to the innovation Doolittle proved feasible. If you modified the aircraft and trained the crews properly, impossible carrier operations became routine. The US Air Force's newest stealth bomber, the B-21, bears the name Raider in explicit honor of the 80 men who established that small forces with innovative tactics could produce strategic consequences far exceeding their physical size. The Raiders held annual reunions with a sacred ritual, silver goblets engraved with each man's name, raised in toast to fallen comrades, then turned upside down as each Raider died. The final gathering in 2013 included only 4 survivors. The last Raider, Staff Sergeant David Thatcher, died in 2019 at age 103, ending a generation that had changed warfare forever. In China, monuments honor the 250,000 civilians who died helping American raiders escape, a sacrifice that validated the alliance against Japanese aggression and demonstrated that shared values transcended national boundaries. The mission's ultimate validation requires no embellishment. Japanese strategists calculated carrier-launched medium bombers were technically impossible. But 80 American volunteers proved that when experts declare something impossible, Americans find a way anyway. That raid, conducted 4 months after Pearl Harbor with 16 expendable aircraft and volunteers willing to die for retaliation, broke Japan's psychological invincibility and established American determination as the Pacific War's decisive weapon. The bombers came from Shangri-La, and Japan never recovered from discovering that American innovation could turn fantasy into burning reality over Tokyo at noon.